What if the clearest way to understand war isn't through another opinion, but through the long view, an elder's memory of what war does to bodies, to families, and national character? I'm Colleen Akiko, welcoming you to the We Be the Change series, A Collage of War. In these 3 episodes, we'll journey into the historical conscience of war with elder author Dan Strawn. We'll consider the entire cost of war, the language that makes war possible, and the everyday choices that can keep us human in the chaos. We don't sensationalize in these episodes. Instead, we slow the pace down to see patterns like greed, first strike thinking, propaganda, and how quickly people can be trained to hate their neighbors. As you listen, notice the constant invitation to stay human, tell the truth, and choose where your attention goes.
From high on Mount Olympus, the wails of mourning mothers in Baghdad and Boise sound the same.
What happens to the human heart when war fades into daily life? In this first episode, when war becomes background noise, Dan Strawn begins with a poem he wrote before the Iraq invasion, and then he widens the frame. War as a bully pattern, war as greed, war as a spiritual injury to a nation's character. This isn't punditry, it's lived memory, it's moral clarity, and a steady insistence to not normalize what should break our hearts. If you felt at all overwhelmed by the current clamor, you'll appreciate the slower tempo of this episode to actually see the shape of what's happening. I'm so blessed and honored to be here with Dan Strawn. Dan is 87, and in his words, he's making the most in the sunset of what has been a productive, full, busy life as a We Be the Change guest blog writer and someone that I have known literally all of my life. I see Dan's strength as being his clarity in being fully human without theatrics, as well as his being willing to follow through on his curiosity and do the research and the work required to really learn and understand something. Dan retired from dual careers in business and education and took up writing, and he has become an award-winning author of several books, articles, collections, short stories, historical fiction and nonfiction, and we have been privileged to have Dan as a guest writer in the Elders Hearth section of the We Be the Change blog. His latest blog post is called Seeing the War Through Old Eyes, and I'd like to ask you, Dan, if you wouldn't mind reading the short poem that opens that post.
Sure. Here it is. The Patriot's Letter. Dear Mr. President, when you embraced Saddam in that grave dance of death, when you and he wage war, remember this: blessed are the peacemakers. From high on Mount Olympus, the wails of mourning mothers in Baghdad and Boise sound the same.
That was a poem you wrote back in 2003.
That's correct.
I know you wrote about this in the blog post, which our listeners can read if they'd like on the We Be the Change blog. I'm wondering if you could give us a little backstory. Why did that come up now, do you feel, in its relevance?
It came up now because we're waging a war. And in my mind, the Iraq war was a mistake in President Bush's decision-making, that the real war should have been in Afghanistan. That's where the people were, and I think history has proved that to be true. But there was a difference in what he did. He didn't surprise anybody with that war. And the war that we just started was a surprise attack in the midst of negotiations. And that's not what President Bush did. Nevertheless, I was a little bit upset. Well, I was a lot upset that we were again going to war for the wrong reasons. And I just felt like I had to say something. I didn't send it to him, but I did share it with close writers and readers of mine. And it was very well received then. And I think it's every bit as apropos right now, in a way, more because of the surprise element of what happened with this current war. And so that's why I printed it at the first of the blog that I wrote, and then went in to expand on why it was appropriate for me to read that now, since its copyright date is 2003, not 2026. A lot's happened since then. But as wars turn out, they turn out to be redundant. And an awful lot of the wars that we fought in our country, and certainly that the world has fought over the centuries, have been for the wrong reasons.
Yes, I appreciate that you delve into the reasons why a just war could happen. It's something that people, unless they have lived in or through a war situation, it's really hard to wrap our minds around even what war is and how it affects people, unless it's happening to people in our own inner circle. And so your writing gets into what you've gone through as an 87-year-old American citizen, your experience with war, your experiences with war, and how that's affected you in your relationships. Your writing seems to be a wonderful way of doing something when we are experiencing just moral outrage at what's going on. Is the writing something that allows you to express something that would otherwise turn into something putrid or hateful inside if you just kept it in?
No, I don't think so. I think that the writing is going to be there, whether I'm irritated or not. The point is that writing is a way of giving people a chance to slow down and look at what they think and what somebody else thinks. And as a little bit of background to my background, yes, it's true that I spent a lot of time in business and I spent a lot of time in education too, but it wasn't in the realm of history. But I've been a history fan since I was 10 years old. And I've also been a patriot since I was 10 years old. So it might be useful to talk a little bit about that, and then I can talk about what caused me to think writing was a way to impress people. So to take it back, Colleen, you mentioned that I had a lot of experience with war. Well, I'm not a warrior. I never was in the military. That doesn't mean I haven't had a lot of experience with it. And one of the first things that I experienced was when I was 7 years old. And at 7 years of age, I was in the tail end of World War II. We were still at war with Germany, and we were still at war with Japan. And I had older cousins and uncles who participated in that war. And my uncle, my dad's youngest brother, was stationed in Italy. And as it turned out, we were at my grandmother's house for almost weekly Sunday dinner. It was August, and they left me there, my mom and dad. We lived 8 or 10 miles away for the week to spend with my grandmother and grandfather. And while I was there, a man came from town. My grandparents lived outside of town on a farm. And he came, and as memory serves me, it was the postmaster of the little town that was close by. I was later to find out that he came to tell my grandmother that her son in Italy was coming home in a casket. I didn't know that at the time. I was outside when that happened, and I was basically locked out, I think, which was fine while they talked. But I could hear my grandmother crying. And that's where the emphasis for this poem, when I say that the wails of mourning mothers in Baghdad and Boise sound the same, There's some alliteration in Baghdad and Boise, but there was a coincidence there too. We lived outside of Boise at that time, Boise, Idaho. That particular event was my introduction to war. I noticed the absence of my older cousins and my older relatives, but I never even really thought about it till that occurred. But that particular event, with my grandmother wailing inside the house and me outside listening to that, not knowing what was going on until the postmaster and my grandfather came out, and my grandfather stopped and he just said, "Well, your grandma had some bad news, but she's going to be okay." And then later on, my mother took me aside when they came to get me and told me what had happened. And so that event, to put it in perspective, gave me nightmares till I was almost 12 years old. And during that time, of course, there were other things that I became more aware of in the world about war. And I'm reminded that in the first grade, when school was just starting, a officer in Navy whites came and explained to us that the Japanese had come up with a plan with giant balloons to catch the winds and hopefully have those balloons land in British Columbia and the Pacific Northwest with explosives to burn down our forests, etc. And there was a warning to all of us in the classroom to stay away from those if we saw those. That was news. And I took that news home. And parents had also heard the same thing. And so that was another event. The whole thing came to a head because of my interest in things about my country and the fact that I always wanted to find out more. So when a lot of kids were doing other kinds of reading, if they were doing any reading at all, I was exploring what was going on in the country before I was a part of it. As I grew older, I realized that war doesn't really do any good. Never has a war happened that we would have been better off without if we'd have found a better solution. Now, unfortunately, there are bullies in the world, and bullies on occasion decide that just because they can, they're going to take advantage of you. As I got older, I can recall having a big discussion once in 8th or 9th grade. I was pretty well informed about our history, and I'm not going to go into details because I don't want to take too much time. But in effect, the history teacher had made a statement about what a great person one of our patriots was, and I took great exception to that. And when he asked me why, I told him why. And again, I'm not going to go into why, but the effect was that he recognized that I was a little more informed, perhaps, than the average 8th grader or 9th grader, whichever it was, and actually apologized and said, I've got to check up on my research. That he never did tell me what he found out is a moot point, but that just told me that I was on the right track, that people are playing with facts that are not always right, and certainly that's happened to me. I'm not criticizing that guy. I just think he thought one thing and found out something else and was willing to at least apologize and say, well, you sound like you know what you're talking about, so I'm going to believe you're right. But as I grew older, I became more involved in that sense. And by the time 2003 rolled around, I had occasions to come to grips with, personally, with war. I mentioned being in 8th grade. When I was in the 6th grade, 7th grade, my older brothers, both of them, one was 6 years older than me, and the other one was 9 years older than me. And the older one got drafted and sent to Korea, and the other one, to avoid that, enlisted in the Air Force and spent 4 years in Japan and was involved in that war, and both of them in one way or another. And then after that, some other things happened, and I'll give you just a quick rundown why I've just grown in the maturing part of my life and becoming an adult and responsible adult. that war is mostly unnecessary. It's driven by greed. It's driven by people who just have power and choose to use it in an inappropriate way. And that's the history, evidently, from what reading I've done, that takes us all the way back to Alexander the Great and before Jesus Christ even was around. So I think that that's really where I came from. And what caused me to feel strongly that way were personal events. And I'll give you one. I was a den father for a Cub Scout troop. And one of the boys in there his first name was David. My oldest son was a classmate of his, and they were both in that Cub Scout troop. And they were both named David. And the David who wasn't my son grew up. And when my son was learning his trade right after high school, the other David was in Vietnam, and he was a medic. And we were very close to his family, by the way. And I read in the paper that he had just been given a Silver Star for bravery. And they defined what he'd done to earn that Silver Star, which put his own life at great risk to land in the middle of a battle on a helicopter and leave the helicopter and tend to stricken soldiers until they could get them on the helicopter, and stayed there with the fighting soldiers to take care of them. And that made me proud of what he'd done, for sure. But I mentioned to my wife at that time, David's that kind of boy, man now, that I don't think he's going to make it home if he continues. And that proved to be true. It wasn't more than a month or two later, he earned another Bronze Star at the cost of his life. And that was, of course, when the war was going on. And after I retired from my business career and expanded on my educational career, my wife and I took a trip to Washington, D.C. and some other places of historical importance to both of us. And we went to that wall and we found his name. And it brought tears to my eyes those 10 years or more later. Same time frame. We lived in Southern California in Riverside at the time. And right outside of Riverside was the Marshfield Air Force Base, which was the headquarters for the 8th Air Force, which was the one that serviced the Pacific. So we had lots of people there during the Vietnam War. And two sisters were living across the street from us. And their husbands were in the Air Force. One was a pilot in active duty in Vietnam, and the other was a sergeant who had a ground assignment of some kind at one of the air bases in Vietnam. One day I was out mowing the lawn, and I guess I noticed this because my dad was working for the Air Force at Marshfield at that time as a civilian. An Air Force car sedan showed up across the street where those two sisters lived, and two uniformed officers got out, and one was carrying a briefcase. And I instinctively knew why they were there. And I just wondered which one it was that was going to be a widow. And it turned out to be the pilot, not the sergeant. And that affected me because they were friends of ours. And when your neighbors get hurt, it hurts. And so that affected me. And the wars that have happened since have just seems so unnecessary to me, except to expand on that just a little bit. There is a need in the world, unfortunately, for war. And that's when people are attacked by people who think they want something that you have. And when you are attacked, you have to defend yourself, of course, in my mind. But it's a sad consequence that has to happen. And historically, not only in our country, but as I look back and have read wars all the way back to the beginning of organized countries, more of them have been fought for greed or for reasons of just because they could than ever for self-defense. And I'd like to say in my heart of hearts that all the wars we've engaged in were because of that reason, self-defense. But unfortunately, that's not true. That's something that has to change in my mind. It has to change not only in our country, but it has to change in the world at large. Because as President Eisenhower, who I just happened to be reading for my last blog for writing that, as he pointed out, even in today's world, and paraphrasing President Eisenhower's word, in today's world, the expanse of our defensive capability matches the expanse of the bullies that might want to be attacking us. So there's no percentages in waging war at all. We've always been taking people down instead of building them up. There's never been a war in the history of wars, in my mind, that were justified, even if some good things happened after that. That doesn't make it true. That idea that we can take advantage of people because we're stronger than them is not a good reason to go to war. I spent 40 years in business, first with a giant-sized company, Fortune 100 company, and then on my own for 14 years. And we never had differences of opinion with our companies that we were competing with that justified us taking them to war. And I think it's an excellent example or metaphor, if you will, for why on earth do we have to kill people just because we can? It just doesn't make sense. And what amazes me is the military people agree with that. I mentioned Eisenhower, pick one, and they all say war's hell, pure hell. That's all it is. And the only reason for justifying it is you're going to have to kill somebody because they're trying to kill you. And that's really not where people need to be. That's not where people need to be.
If this stirred something in you and you'd rather not process it alone, the Bowl of Light Café is a free virtual place to practice presence and reflection together. Find it at SongRise.live, SongRise.live.